Hello everybody, this is Possibility Wave, and we have a presentation here. It's part 4 of a larger series. The series is entitled Signal Encoding Theory in Biofeedback. Part 4 has got 5 segments. This is segment number 1 of 5 segments. As in the other parts, I'm Garnet Dupuy. I'm your presenter. I'm pleased to say I'm co-founder and creative designer of Possibility Wave and have a marvelous team behind everything. If you want to connect with us, it's easy. You can go to possibilitywave.com, all one word, possibilitywave.com. And you can tap in, find out what's going on, keep abreast of all the information, as well as connecting with the Possibility Wave Open Classroom, which is the learning division of Possibility Wave. Some of you may be very well aware, if you're following through this series part by part, there are 4 parts. As I've mentioned, this is part number 4. The information encoding of signals. Part 1, the boundaries of belief. Part 2, compassionate communication. Part 3, the energy encoding of signals, bringing us here to part 4. Admittedly, it's best to proceed through the series in sequence. One part is designed to be followed by another. They build on certain principles and concepts. Now, you don't have to follow the sequence, but I would encourage it, and if you don't, you may find it helpful to check into earlier parts that develop certain concepts found in the different later parts. Here is a slide that just briefly gives some better hint as to the contents of each part. If you don't mind the review, if you've been following it, boundaries of belief, our belief systems, how they affect our understanding. It's really the gatekeeper to the whole discovery and learning process here. Compassionate communication explores the nature of communication itself and, importantly, how we can connect the word compassion with communication. Part 3 that precedes this part 4 is the exploration of the use of applied energy in the encoding of signals. It's a wonderful view into a subject that has often been not discussed. And here we are, part 4, using pure information in the encoding of signals. As I mentioned, part 4 does have 5 segments. This is segment number 1. Part 4, segment number 1, information encoding of signals. Let's go. Before we get started, there are a couple of points, a few points that I really believe are important to clarify. The subject of part 4 is challenging in and of itself, and there are a few basic things that have been developed to this point that I'd like to review, perhaps clarify. Okay, we have a company. The company is called Possibility Wave. And one aspect of the company produces information-coded biofeedback programs. We could also call them applications or tools. Another aspect of Possibility Wave is the learning experience. We call that the Possibility Wave Open Classroom. And as an example, this series is an offering for free from the Open Classroom of Possibility Wave. So we have programs. This whole series is exploring information codes, how to encode the processes. And this is something that I think we need to have just a little look to make sure you're clear, that we use the information codes as significant elements in the overall functional design of the programs. So we have programs, and they have a lot of different design features that allow them to function in the way that they do. And an important element of that overall design is the use of information codes. We use these information codes in assessment, in analysis, and reinforcement stages of the overall program functions. I don't want you to mix up the concept and principle of code and that of the program. The program functions with design principles greater than, in some cases different than, the codes, but the codes are part of the program. So don't mix up the code and the program. Information-coded biofeedback programs have as significant elements in its functional design information codes. To look a little bit closer at the information code, you will recall, especially and hopefully if you've had the chance to experience part 3, that there are two basic approaches to creating an information code. One is the applied energy process, or processes. There are numbers of them. These have already been detailed in part 3. If you need clarification, or if you've not yet had a look, I would encourage you to spend time with part 3, because there's a distinct difference with some overlap between part 3 and part 4, because part 4, which is what we're getting into here, it's all about using pure information processes to create these codes. So there are two basic approaches to creating an information code: applied energy processes and pure information processes. You know, so whether you choose to create a code using the applied energy approach, or whether you choose to create a code using a pure information approach, you're still going to end up with what we'll call a final result, a final code. I don't want you to mix up the approach that you use with the result of a code. The approach that you use, it's up to you. It's basically a matter of preference. And as I say here, perhaps and usually strongly related to your axiom, your boundary of belief. Don't mix up the approach used to create the code and the resultant code. You're going to end up with a code, an information code, regardless of which approach you use. And in some cases, you can even marry the two in a kind of a cooperative approach. Typically, you choose one or the other. The last point to clarify before we go on, this goes all the way back into part 1, is to understand that once you have these codes, you can do all kinds of different things with them. I've mentioned you can do, say, assessment processes. You can do analyses of certain types and purposes. You can also use them as sources for stimulation to create reinforcements, influencing the subject in certain positive ways. And how you choose to design that stimulation, also there's a range in choice. You can stimulate at a pure information level. You can interpret, you can translate these encrypted codes into, for example, sound waves, a sonic information code, or you can have it as light, photonic, electronic, magnetic. You can even use it as a resource to imprint the codes in certain mediums. So 3 things I want you to be clear about as we focus in quite depth the whole issue of creating these information codes. Number 1, codes are used in the program, but the program has a lot of other features outside of the code. So don't get the code mixed up as being equivalent with the program. It's not equivalent. It's used as a significant element of the program. Number 2, there are 2 basic ways to create an information code. One is an applied energy approach. The other is a pure information approach. The one you use is up to you, depending on a whole range of circumstances and details. In any case, in either case, you're going to end up with an information code. The last point is, in terms of stimulations, or what I will call reinforcements, that you want to deliver, you can use these information codes and translate or interpret them into different forms of expressions. So when you're using an information code, regardless of how you created it, you can also choose the delivery method, how it is you want that code expressed or to influence the subject. And there are different ways of doing it, and sometimes you can even overlap and use multiple styles simultaneously. So those are the three things that I wanted to clarify, because as we go further here into the pure information process to create codes, if you're a little bit mixed up about those things, then you can get tangled. So I don't want you to get tangled. To repeat myself a bit, here you can see the slide. The point is, information-coded biofeedback programs can utilize the full spectrum of influences ranging from awareness itself, all the aspects of consciousness, information, energy, and matter. The process and information-coded biofeedback programs, they rely on the information codes, but they're not limited to pure information dynamics throughout the whole program. I call this category, this type of biofeedback, information-coded biofeedback, for those reasons. Okay, let's get started. This part 4, as I believe you understand, is dedicated to exploring pure information processes and how to use these, what they are, and how you do it, and understanding more of the background and the depth of it, how you can use pure information processes to create information codes. I've described in the past, this is a kind of a template or a formula in a way, that it's a three-step approach. The first step is that you have to, in some manner, identify the information aspect of the item. Bring it out, recognize it, mirror it, do something so that these characteristics become evident. As they become evident in this identification process, you then apply typically certain algorithms, certain calculated manipulations of the information to create an encoding of the information. So now you have a signature, in a sense, a signal signature of the information characteristics of the item. And then the last thing important in biofeedback is the fact that we have to have repeated, very rapid access to these encoded information characteristics. So we have to store them in such a way that we can use them repeatedly for all sorts of tasks. And we do this through various processes of encryption. Encryption is used throughout industry all the time now, ways of storing information in a veritable way, a faithful way, in a safe way, that then you can access innumerable times for multiple purposes. So the three-step approach: identify, encode, and store. Information. The subject of information itself, I say here, is both delightful, it is to me, and demanding. I agree. My invitation, I won't say warning, is get ready for some open-minded exploration here. Personal reactions. I sometimes imagine, a whole group of people exposed to this. I'm sitting here almost by myself right now. I'm up in my home in northern Thailand, and sitting beside me on my desk is a little monkey named Jada. He's actually a Geoffroy marmoset. So he's my only audience right now in real time. But everybody else, depending on your personal axioms, your belief systems, that's a subject that we go into great depth in part 1. This subject is going to be, well, either obvious. It's something that you recognized a long time ago and you celebrated with me. Or the subject may be a rather new discovery, one that opens like a flower blossoming before your eyes. Or it may be a hard pill to swallow, but you're going to give it a chance. Spend some time, think about it. Listen to this, consider it. Or, number 4, this is sheer stupidity to even consider it as possible. I don't know. I hope that you're up at the top of this list, but if not, then okay, I'll give it my best shot. So this is either something obvious, something you recognized a long time ago, a new discovery that opens like a flower blossoming before your eyes, a hard pill to swallow, but you'll give it a chance. Or sheer stupidity to even consider as possible. Wow. The slide is entitled, "It Only Seems Fair." Yeah, I can say it seems fair that we have to have a little bit of a better look into the whole concept of information itself. And because here in this part 4, we're focusing on the use of what I label pure information in the encoding of information codes, it's really important to get different ideas loosely exposed as to what information is all about, what we mean, what the term refers to. Undoubtedly, you've noticed by now my repeated use of the word pure combined with information. I had said that there are 2 approaches to creating information codes. One is the application of energy, conventional energy, electromagnetics or mechanical vibration, something. And the second is pure information processes, an approach using pure information. So I need to define that better, no doubt. And this is the point of view of possibility wave. When we use the term pure information, we mean that this process does not principally depend on energy as the medium of the process. That's the first thing. It may be difficult to exclude conventional energy in every single minute aspect. That's why I say here, it does not principally depend on energy, and that's for sure. And you'll see as we go further through all the segments, because all the segments combined is likely to end up being a few hours, that the pure information process has as a critical component, a critical role is played by consciousness. So to better appreciate, to understand where I'm coming from, what possibility wave means when we use the term pure information, you could say 2 things here. It does not principally depend on energy as the medium in the process, and that it relies heavily on the involvement of consciousness. Here's another way of thinking about it. You can, conceptualize using applied energy in the process as a kind of a bottom-up approach. And as it may not be a surprise, the opposite is that the pure information process, you could think of it as a top-down approach. So whether you want to go bottom-up or top-down, it's a decision. When we work with this top-down approach, what I'm calling here the pure information approach, consciousness dynamics are used in a fundamental way to access the information characteristics. And the bottom-up approach, using applied energy, uses energy dynamics to access these same information characteristics. It's hard to put a value on which one being better or not. I really don't think there's one that's better. They're similar in some ways and different in other ways. And as I say, it kind of depends on what you believe, where your talents lie, what kinds of technology you're familiar with and have access to. It's a decision. Top down, bottom up. In part 3, we spent a good chunk of time exploring the bottom-up approach using applied energy. And here in part 4, in all of its segments, we're going to be going very deeply into the top-down approach, using pure information approaches to create these information codes. In this case, consciousness plays a very significant role. So to capture it on one screen so that you can refer to it either mentally or visually, pure information means we do not use applied energy as a primary means to identify the information characteristics to create the code. We integrate various aspects of consciousness. This is considered critical in creating information codes, drawing out the information characteristics in the pure information process. I keep on kind of going back to the fine print, but it's so important when exploring areas that are demanding or challenging in terms of belief. Way back in part 1, we made an agreement about words. We had agreed, at least I had proposed that we agree, to accept that the very same word can have different meanings to different people. And this is made even more important when we try to work with a concept using a word like information that jumps from language to language and culture to culture and even historically from time period to time period. Very, very tricky stuff. So let's agree to not to jump to conclusions. Let's not jump to conclusions. Let's let it work its way through our thinking and see where we end up. Of course, your conclusions are your own. They're certainly not mine. But let's proceed with respect and a bit of patience. Whenever we're talking about something, because we use words, there's this good old resource called the dictionary. Let's have a look with a simple dictionary. What's this thing, this word information? A basic one is, and you know, the meanings, the terms really evolve. But in any case, a basic one, the communication of intelligence. You see I have those two words underlined if you see the screen. The communication or reception of knowledge or intelligence. The communication of intelligence strongly parallels the possibility wave definition of information. Information being the intelligence aspect of awareness. The word itself in English actually derived from the French informer, and more deeply than that from the Latin verb informare. Basically, it means to give form or to form an idea of. Okay, you can see it just in the spelling, form. But, you know, what does it really mean, form? Because form kind of means shape. Does it mean physical? If you go even further back than the Latin into the Greek, morph or eidos, we know the word morph because we use it a lot in English, the morphology, and with Sheldrake's work, the morphogenic fields, and you know, the Greek carries layers of meaning. The idea of shape, but also the idea of kind. This also be, you know, if you've been a student in philosophy, back to Plato and Aristotle and that incredible classic Greek period, you'd recognize that the word has a really profound philosophical sense with Plato and also with Aristotle, because they had this idea, especially early Plato, this idea that there was this idealized form, which was non-physical, some kind of an essence. So, you know, information, it's a bit challenging. This issue, it's been at the heart of the brightest minds throughout history. I mean, here you can see three of the famous Westerners, and it's not only confined to Western thought, obviously, but, you know, that's our culture primarily, and at least my culture, so I'm aware of these. Middle Eastern, Asian, I'm sure it was going on. I don't have the background to refer to it, sorrowfully. But here, you know, Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, they all worked, and throughout our history, you know, the Western thinkers kept on struggling, really, with this whole issue of, you know, how does reality know how to behave? With the Greeks, we're working with the concept of gods. Gods as archetypes, you could say, psychological archetypes, energetic archetypes, whether they're real beings or semi-real. We won't go there, but if you look back into Greek, what's usually called mythology, you see this character called Hermes. And he happens to have been a son of Zeus and considered a god. His thing, his identity was that he was the messenger, he was the emissary. And what you recognize in this, if you consider them archetypes, at least, what you see is this is one of the very earliest attempts to recognize the principle of information as a distinct process involved in the multiplicity of varied aspects of consciousness, that it had a very high status, and that its status in the realm of the gods, you could say, or in the different states of consciousness, was that it allowed one to know the other, and as a messenger or emissary, this information was critical for all sorts of conditions and circumstances. So here you see as an archetype, a Greek god that we could think of as, that's an interesting way to identify or isolate the principle that we call information. Back to the Greeks with Aristotle, his credentials are just about as good as you can get. He was the principal student of Plato and also the teacher of Alexander the Great. Well, that's pretty strong stuff. He has a view of reality, and he worked with, again, I'm taking out of the Greek into the English, so this is really basic, but the merging of form and matter. Now, this was something that he was really working to try to refine and express in an intelligible way. And for him, the aspect that we call form is basically close to a lot of the principles that today we call information. And why this is really significant is because in the West, for about 2,000 years, his ideas were really considered primary. They moved along, you know, through great Western thinkers where they worked to modify them or elaborate upon them, but he really held reign for a great long period of time, you know, all the way through Augustine and Thomas Aquinas and others that worked at trying to appreciate this. Aristotle, until the scientific enlightenment, his ideas held pretty strong. That's amazing, you know, geez, 2,000 years. Here I'm mentioning that it's quite possible that in future presentations from Possibility Wave, we may return a bit more to Aristotle, because he had this principle called potentia. And remarkably, it has a lot of similarities to our current concept of quantum probability. You will understand that possible, probable, certain is the subtitle, the byline of Adapt Wellness, our first information-coded biofeedback program. So anything to do with probability is right in our right in our playing field. So here we have it. I'm hoping you're okay with this time spent looking at information, because it's so easy to jump to a conclusion. You see the word, you say, oh, I know what that is. An information coded biofeedback, that, oh, I know what that is. An information codes, oh, I know what that is. Knowing what it is at a better level, it does take some thinking, and that's what I'm inviting you to do right now. So here we have, and I've described this all the way from the early Greeks to the Middle Ages. Information had a basic concept, and the idea was that information was the factor, the dynamic, that brought form into matter. It really wasn't until around, famously, our hero or anti-hero in some cases, Descartes, that the concept began to shift, where you began to think of information as a communication or an intelligence. You might notice that in the earlier concept, the principle of consciousness didn't really have a strong factor in the equation. There was some kind of force or principle or essence that allowed matter to take form, and that was what we would call the information principle. But then it started to change with the idea of communication. And when you talk about communication or intelligence, you're automatically implying the phenomena that we call consciousness. Then we jump from the scientific revolution a couple of hundred years into what we'll call our modern day, which someday won't be modern, but it'll be the past. But anyway, our modern day, which in this case begins in and around the mid-1900s, in the mid-1950s, where two important thinkers, Shannon and Weiner, then again took information, and the concept shifted away into something that's a quantifiable measurement. Different than the early Greeks with form into matter, quite different from the communication of intelligence. They're not really interested in the content, they're interested in the capacity. And this is very important with current technology. Information systems reliant upon technology. And there's certainly nothing bad about it. I'm not dishing it. Quite the contrary, I respect it. It's just that it's very interesting to see how the concept of information has evolved, and certainly now is still evolving. So when we begin to move around, because here at Possibility Wave, we call this whole aspect of discovery, we call it mystical science. So there is a sort of a mystical or spiritual or less substantial aspect, but it is still scientific. And in the world of science, when you talk about information, if you say information or information theory, most people are going to believe that you're referring to the whole aspect of information theory as applied to electronic communications. This is an area of applied mathematics and computer science, and it's all about the quantification, the measurable aspects of signal characteristics. Be aware that this form of information theory does not have a direct relationship with the possibility wave view. And although it is possible to make very interesting correlations or comparisons, it's also really an invitation for a lot of complication. There isn't just one way, even though certain dominant ways will appear. There isn't just one way to appreciate and explore the concepts, the principles, and the dynamics, even the functions of what we call information. It's a word. Be careful to not get trapped and jumping into a conclusion as to what is meant as soon as you see that little symbol in the word information. I think you've probably realized the angle that I'm coming from here, that communication now as a basic fact, is changing the landscape of society. And because we have so much access to, here's the word, information, there are so many meanings, such a wide variety of uses for a term. You know, for example, if you go more into the science and philosophy of it, you recognize that they even say there's the counting form of information, there's the shaping form of information, there's the meaning form of information. That's just to name a few. So I want to avoid complete confusion here, and I'm going to narrow this down so that we have something as a conceptual reference when we talk to each other or others about information, because Possibility Wave specializes in information-coded biofeedback. So if we can't have a reasonable appreciation of the meaning there, you know, we're going to launch ourselves into just a bunch of vagaries. I don't want that. I guess another thing I have to mention here. I wonder sometimes, you know, how much to put into a presentation like this, and I figure at least to hit the high points that you're bound to encounter if you are exploring the concept of information, that it's important to at least mention in a slide or two so that you know that we're aware of it and you know that we have a basic position on it. But it's not our role to go into significant depth with any one of these things for our purposes here. Anytime in a contemporary discussion with information, you're going to bump into the Shannon thing, the quantifiable signal. You're also going to, as even part of their theory, you're going to encounter this concept of entropy. And what does entropy mean? Basically, it means you have a system that is ordered, that bit by bit by bit by bit by bit goes gradually, sometimes rapidly, but certainly gradually, it declines from order to disorder. And you can see up in the slide, if you're noticing, here's a box with little marbles or something that are divided. It's very nicely organized. You've got the blue, you've got the red. And then you take it through a process, an energetic process. In this case, you just shake the box. Just shake it and shake it. And what happens is all the marbles get mixed up. That's disorder. That's moving towards increasing entropy. And you know, right now, if you're aware, the current prevailing axiom in modern scientific thought, although happily I think it's weakening and changing, is that the entire universe is drifting towards this absolute disorder, an entire loss of potential. And I don't know, in a certain frame of mind, that sounds kind of discouraging to me. We'll see. Fortunately, over the past few decades, it's been recognized that every event that occurs, even the shaking of that box, that there's information being gained in this. It may not be easily evident, it may not be easy to derive as characteristics, but there's a lot of information being gathered all the time, and that living systems thrive on this. It's called negative entropy or negentropy. It's a horrible name, but it's a good thing, even though it's a bad sounding name. And it means that the content of information in the universe is constantly increasing. At some point, maybe we'll discuss this thing called a non-equilibrium or far from equilibrium state. That's you and me. Living systems defy this entropy business, because even though we shake and bounce around all the time, you know, our body temperature is not being made equivalent to the room temperature. We're somehow able to maintain the famously 98.6 Fahrenheit or thereabout. So as you go into, and you may do this, you know, because the subject of information is really it's at the leading edge of exploration. You know, the energy thing was in last century, the 20th century. The issue of the 21st century is not energy, it's information. The last bugaboo to comment on is this thing called chaos, basically equivalent to randomness. The basic concept, the conventional concept, is that chaos or randomness is totally lacking in information because of its lack of organization. It's just a big mess. And that state is one that we drift towards. Fortunately, new appreciations point to the fact that chaos or randomness is actually full of information. Hard to find the right expression here, but it's pre-expression. It's information in the pre-expression phase. Another way of saying it is that the information is there, we just don't know how to get to it. This is very similar to a radical appreciation emerging over these past few decades. Here we're saying that chaos is actually full of information in a pre-expression phase. Well, the other issue that is parallel is that this thing that we call the vacuum or the void, which is a whole bunch of like nothing, is not nothing at all, that it's actually incredibly full of energy. And this energy, again, is in a kind of pre-expression phase. You know, deep thinking, but entirely relevant to the direct experience that we have being alive. Okay. If you've been able to suffer through that, if we focus too much on the term itself, we're going to get confused. It's had many names throughout history. It varies from culture to culture, language to language. Let's just return to the fact that possibility wave defines information as the intelligence aspect of awareness, and that this principle, this dynamic, influences all the modulations of consciousness, as well as the behaviors of energy and the forms and shapes of matter. Information is the intelligence aspect of awareness. Even more simple than that, and I love this, Gregory Bateson is one of my favorites, absolutely. He's a complex systems thinker. He says, information, it's a difference that makes a difference. A difference that makes a difference. And the other one, the one that I'm particularly fond of, he says that information is news of change. We're going to have a much better look at the whole issue of change in an upcoming Possibility Wave series through Open Classroom. It's called Adapt or Die, the role of adaptation in living systems. And whenever you talk about adaptation, automatically, irresistibly, you have to explore and consider the whole issue of change. So news of change, that's what Bateson says is information. One thing for sure, information's not a thing. We've got to be careful here. As Western reductionists, we have a philosophical habit, you know, that we always like taking things apart. Smaller and smaller things, smaller and smaller objects. I remember as a kid I had this little robot, you know, battery-powered thing, very, very simple. And one day I decided to take it apart. That's a big mistake. And I took it apart, and then I put it back together again, or at least I tried. And I put the whole thing back together again, but there were two pieces that I had left over. I could never figure out where they went. It's part of the problem, part of the challenge when you break things apart, trying to find the things or the objects that make it up. This habit, it's called reification. And reification you have to be very careful with. It's really got to be avoided when you go exploring into something like information. And I'm also warning you that this nasty habit also extends into the exploration of energy and matter. So be careful with the tendency to reify, to somehow try to get in your head what a process is by deciding that it's a thing, it's an object of some sort. Information is not a thing. Okay. You know by now, I'll make reference, this is what underlies all of this discussion that possibility defines information as the intelligence aspect of awareness. Information does not have awareness. Information is awareness expressing itself as intelligence. Part 3, we talked about the verb to be and the verb to have, and it goes all the way also back to even part 1. Here we are at the end of this, and I'll leave you with this thought to end segment number 1, that there are a number of faces to information. That if you take what we call information in relation to consciousness, we call that intelligence. If you take information in relation to this dynamic, this activity, this energy, that ends up expressing itself as behavior. Information plus matter, we get shape and form, substance. And information in relation to this space, that's potential. You can see how information is underneath it all and really inextricably woven into all of these. Okay, this is the end of segment number 1. It's about 45 minutes of your time. You will remember that there are 4 parts in the entire series. This is part number 4. Part number 4 has 5 segments. This is the end of segment number 1. I hope you'll check out segment number 2. Take care. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.